Hello, it's Amy. I'm back again with the Journal of Emily Shore, and we're diving back into the year 1836. This is the year that she is 17 to 18 years old, and in the previous readings, we had seen her begin to recover from a very long illness. Her parents had taken her away from Woodbury to a better climate with the hopes that she would recover and that her lungs would be safeguarded from consumption. They saw a doctor in London and then continued on their way to a seaside town. And I just want to make sure I get it absolutely correct. Yes, they have continued on to Hastings, where the climate is better than Woodbury and much better than the extreme heat that they found in London. And so we are in August of 1836. She has an entry here for August 17th, which was a Wednesday. And she says, "I finished reading the first volume of Mrs. Trollope's very entertaining, prejudiced, and ill-natured work, Domestic Manners of the Americans, a subject on which she had no business to write at all, and at all events it was very unfair of her to describe the manners of the half-civilized back settlements as those of the whole nation, which she certainly does, though at the outset she pretends not to do so." And yes, Mrs. Trollope's Domestic Manners of Americans. I've not read this work, but it has a reputation for being somewhat disliked by its American audiences in its day. And I believe Mrs. Trollope has some relationship to the author Anthony Trollope. I think it might have been his mother or something along those lines. But I can't remember whether that inclination in my mind is correct right now, or whether that's not the case at all. But yes, so I guess she read Mrs. Trollope and did not like it. A staymaker by name, Mrs. Howes of number 82 High Street, who works for Mamma, gave her today a touching account of the many afflictions she has endured. She was daughter to a wealthy farmer, and in early life was waited on by servants and rode in her own carriage. Her father dissipated his property, and she afterwards fell into the greatest poverty, so that she had been 3 days together unable to afford a fire, and has only a crust of bread to eat. 10 years ago she fell from an upper story, a height of 15 feet, and by the fall dislocated her hip, broke 3 ribs, and broke 1 leg. From these injuries she was about 2 years in recovering. Then she had the typhus fever and was not well for 15 months. This was followed by smallpox, and this last winter she has had an inflammation of the lungs, so that now she is very thin and looks extremely ill. In 1 12-month she has had 7 deaths in her family, of which 3 were her children and 2 were her parents. Last year she had an execution in her house, her landlord, himself much distressed for money, being able to wait no longer. She could easily have paid it all, but that the ladies for whom she worked would not pay their debts. There were no less than 7 of these ladies in Wellington Square. Their unfortunate creditor went to them, represented her case, and begged relief, but got not a 6 pence of her money, and the execution took place. I'm not quite understanding what an execution here is. I wonder if it means kind of an auction, because I'm assuming they're not talking about someone being literally executed as in killed by the state. Well, let's read on and see if we can figure out what's going on. There were no less than 7 of these ladies in Wellington Square. Their unfortunate creditor went to them, represented her case, and begged relief, but got not a 6 pence of her money, and the execution took place. Amongst other things, her flowers, of which she had been particularly fond, were sold. One of these, a favourite fuchsia, worth 7 shillings. A lady gave her a sovereign, for which was a great assistance to her in the distress she was now thrown into. After this, she took another lodging, and by degrees began to prosper again in her profession. When the Duchess of Kent and the Princess Victoria were here, and all the tradespeople in the place sent presents to them, Mrs. Howes, having nothing else to offer, presented to the princess a pair of stays of blue silk, which cost her in making them £14. She got nothing in return but a letter of thanks, which, however, did her some good, as it made her known. And now she writes on her cards, appointed by their Royal Highnesses, etc., etc. August 18, Thursday. The bathing women, for Louisa bathes in the sea every morning, told Mamma a few particulars about the family at number 36. It seems that there is a great mortality among them. As soon as they arrive at the age of 20, they die, and one whose hearse we saw was the fourth of them thus prematurely cut off, and one of them now is expected to have her turn, apparently, the pale one, the elder of the two. What they die of we could not make out, probably consumption, though it seems to be a very rapid one. The one whom we distinguish as pretty does not seem to want cheerfulness, but the other looks melancholy, and I have never seen her smile. The boys, too, are pale and slightly made. August 28, Sunday. We went to bed trembling for the weather tomorrow, the important day of our journey. The air was perfectly calm and clear. The sunset was a bright pale yellow. There were some large purple clouds blotching the south and west. The moon rose small and red, her orb hazy and ill-defined, which we thought a bad sign. And then in brackets, on August 29, the travellers reached Tunbridge and spent 3 nights there. August 30, Tuesday. The first thing I did after I was dressed, which was a little after 8 o'clock, was to sally forth to procure a draught of new milk, resuming my old practice at Woodbury before I went to Hastings. It was a sweet morning, and I enjoyed the draught the more from having walked for it. The milkwoman, Mrs. Waite, lives near the mill, just 5 minutes' walk from Miss Husey's abode in a brick house where grandeur surprised me. I was shown into a little parlour where a glass tumbler of rich foaming milk was brought me by Mrs. Waite herself. She looks as if she fully understood its nourishing qualities. On returning, I walked about my cousin's garden, exceedingly enjoying the dewy freshness of a country morning, after having been confined in my morning walk for 2 months to the glare of a parade. It was quite delightful to me to hear once more the sweet songs of robin, wren, and swallow, and to be surrounded by flowers and trees not stunted by the sea air. In driving through Tunbridge in this open carriage, I could observe much better than when in the coach what sort of place it is. It consists principally of a single street almost a mile long, sufficiently wide, and for the greater part of the way sufficiently clean. It is an old town, and most of the houses have an antique look. One in particular I noticed, which had projecting stories and a cinquefoil moulding round the gable end. It would have been a good subject for Prout. The long street crosses the Medway, which even here is a very pretty little stream. It is bordered with willow herbs and covered with yellow water lilies. It winds through the thick, shady trees, from the midst of which peeps the grey old castle, shrouded in luxuriant ivy and crowned with tufts of foliage. And that brings us to the end of August. We are at 9 minutes. So perhaps we'll read a few entries into September when they are back in London, because I'm just seeing about 2 pages farther they'll be back at Woodbury. So we'll read through London. September 1st, Thursday. We are again at London, where we are to remain 2 nights for the purpose of seeing Dr. James Clark again. We set off from Tunbridge at 10:30 o'clock in the Telegraph, a Tunbridge Wells coach. We were not so fortunate as to have the whole inside to ourselves, for we had 2 fellow passengers, both ladies. One was about 45 years old, in deep mourning, and evidently suffering both in mind and body. Her face was thin and ghastly, and by her compressed lips and downcast eyes, she seemed to be struggling hard with tears. She spoke not a word the whole time, and noticed nothing that passed. The other was a jolly old woman, very fat, merry, and talkative, dressed up in gay silks and wearing false flaxen hair. She bore in her countenance the trace of considerable beauty, and was fair and blue-eyed. We found her a very communicative and amusing travelling companion. Indeed, she gave utterance to a great deal more than we could hear or comprehend, owing to the rattling of the coach and the rapidity of her speech. She was a woman who knew the world and led a gay life. She told us she lived 7 miles from town, and had been staying with a friend at Tunchbid Wells. The Surrey side is by no means the worst part of London. The streets are in general very wide and pretty regular, and the houses not mean. We stopped a little while near the Elephant and Castle, and saw close to us, at the corner of 2 very broad streets, the Rockingham Arms, one of those pestilential gin shops. It is a very fine large building, handsomely adorned with pilasters. 2 ragged and sickly wretches, a man and a woman, skulked out of a little door while I was looking. I make no doubt there was a pawnbroker's shop close by. September 2nd, Friday. Dr. Clark spent nearly an hour in examining me, which he did with the greatest care and minuteness. He pronounced me much better in every respect, and finds my health more improved than he had expected. Indeed, I am scarcely like the same person, and I could perceive the greatest difference in my sensations when he tapped me with his hand. When he did it last time, it gave me great pain on the left side of my chest, but this time it gave me none. He observed that I was much fatter than when he saw me before, but he says that I still require as much care as ever, and that it is extremely important to attend to my diet, that constant change of air by long drives is highly desirable, and alas, I must by no means remain during the winter in so cold a place as Woodbury. He recommends Torquay as the best place for me to go, and says I ought to go in October, so that I am now going home to Woodbury for but a very short time. September 3rd, Saturday. Papa having last week taken our place in the Bedford Times coach, we set off at 2 o'clock. For some time we flattered ourselves that we were to travel alone, but such happiness was not ours, for at the Peacock Inn in Ingliston we took up a lady in green silk, who presently doffed her gloves in order to display a finger quite manacled with gaudy rings. She was a tall woman with a brown face and large features. We found her uncommunicative. Not so a gentleman of great size, who to our annoyance came inside for one stage and kept up a constantly noisy conversation, of which every other sentence was obscured by a loud, unmeaning laugh. Who he was I cannot tell. Not her husband, though she was a married woman by name Mrs. Taylor. She, it seems, had just returned from a trip to Boulogne, which she much enjoyed, except with regard to the society, the 3-shilling people who thronged the place from London. I found it amusing to listen to their conversation. They rattled away at a prodigious rate. The gentleman showed us a watch, which he said had been the property of a great Duke of Marlborough. It was a curious and clumsy machine, but very handsome and richly wrought. And so that is their departure from London. And when we return for the next reading, Emily shall be back at Woodbury for a brief period of time before, I'm assuming, she will be heading on to Torquay. And I'm just flipping a few pages ahead, wondering if there's going to be a heading. It looks like we're spending a great deal of time, a great deal of passages at Woodbury. She's back to London, and then we see at Exeter. So perhaps they don't go to Torquay at all. Perhaps they are on to Exeter. Or perhaps those are the same place, and I just have a poor knowledge of geography. But she will be leaving Woodbury for the winter for her health, and hopefully she will remain, fairly well. We still have about half the journal to go, so I would assume her health will stay fairly well for a while before that inevitable illness comes back.